All right, and we're live. Welcome to the first session of the day in the Open Data Science Forum. We have a fabulous lineup of expert speakers. And in this particular session, we have Richard Whitt and Sunil Daluvoy. And just to give a little bit self-introduction, my name is Joaquin Malata. I'm the founder of the Swarm community. Co-hosting, co-moderating this session is Michelle Yee. Would you like to give a little bit of background on yourself and some of the work that you're doing with women in data?
Yeah, thanks, Joaquin. So, hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Yee. I'm so excited to be representing Women in Data today. My background personally is in AI research over the last 20 years or so. And then, of course, productionalizing that research. At Women in Data, I serve on the board, and this is my second term. In particular, this year, I'm chairing the AI Ethics Committee, which Sunil is also a member of. And we're really passionate about addressing this topic of open science together, especially in the field of data and AI. It's so critical. I think there's a lot of confusion and it's certainly not discussed enough. And so, yeah, as part of Women in Data, we're looking to empower women to be a part of this conversation and to hopefully bring our perspective to critical issues like this.
Thank you, Michelle. Richard and Sunil, would you like to give a little bit of a background on who you are, some of the work you've done, and what you're currently working on now?
Maybe I'll go in a very alphabetical order because normally the W's we go last. So if it's okay with you, Sunil, just no. Hi, everybody. Richard Whitt. I'm a former longtime lawyer at Google, as I like to say, almost 12 years there, where I worked on issues like net neutrality, in which the term of openness became pretty much a rhetorical flourish on both sides. And then since leaving in 2018, I was a fellow at Mozilla for 3.5 years. I joined Twilio for a couple. I'm currently running a small coalition of companies called the GliaNet Alliance, which I can talk maybe more about at the latter stages of our conversation here. But the notion of openness within data, within AI, has been a pretty core aspect of my career through much of my 30 plus years in the industry. So I thank you all for inviting me and look forward to the conversation.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me, Michelle, Joaquin. My name is Sunil Daluvoy. I actually started my career as a lawyer as well, but in the capacity as a government regulator. I had a front row seat to the birth of broadband as a lawyer at the Federal Communications Commission. And I soon realized that the government wasn't my future. And so, but I learned a lot, and accomplished its goals. And I jumped to the private sector and working in the Web 1 world. And I took a position at Yahoo, then at Google, and then at Uber. So it kind of covers a vast span of different companies, different eras. But the common denominator is taking new technologies to mass market, new services to mass market, and what are the challenges related there too. A lot of my work has involved public policy elements to it. So I haven't fully given up my legal background, legal work. And so hopefully bring that to bear in the current debates with AI. Currently, I have an AI startup called Sift AI, which I co-founded. It helps companies manage their external communities. I'm also involved with Women in Data and their ethics committee to help make sure that more responsible, more accurate AI models are being built. And I also do some advisory work and of course, make time to speak on important panels like this.
Well, thank you very much for providing a little bit of your background. I hope that this contextualizes the conversation a little bit on what we're going to be getting into. I just asked the audience if you have any questions, feel free to do so. Ask them asynchronously. I see Mimi is saying woohoo! Thanks for leading women in data science, women in data, Michelle. So as you ask questions, we'll put them on board and answer them as they come on. So transitioning into the fireside discussion. The spectrum of open science is a very vague title, but it's something that encompasses a lot of different elements in the technical realm, in the scientific realm, in the commercial realm. So we hope to do some justice to that. Perhaps, Richard, you can start us off and help us define what it means to be open.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Joaquin. Yeah, the term openness, obviously, for the most part, has very positive connotations for many people, right? If you say you have an open mind, it means, oh, you're somebody more flexible, adaptable, open to the world. If you are closed-minded, not so much. Open really hit the mark in the 70s, roughly speaking, with open source. That was in the technology space, the idea that you could actually build software that was not proprietary, that was not closed down, quote unquote, by licensing processes. And then more after that, then we got into things like the internet and the TCP/IP protocol, which itself was a quote open standard, which allowed anybody to come and build on top of it. But I think it's important to step back just for a moment and think about openness in the context of what we are discussing, which is a system or a network. And when you think about system sciences, this goes back much further than even the use of the term openness in the more recent networking context that we're familiar with. So if you think about a system, it's something that's defined by a boundary. There's an inner and an outer. And really, when we talk about openness, in a sense, it's a secondary quality to that notion of boundary creation and maintenance, and how much permeability there is between sort of the inner and the outer. All systems interact in various ways. So we can think of countless natural systems, of course, physical systems, human-made systems more recently, like the internet. But these are all things that have these semi-permeable boundaries. There's no such thing as completely open system, because if it was, it would just dissipate into thin air. Nor is there such a thing as a totally closed system that would just suffocate from a lack of any ability to interact with its environment. So we're talking about degrees, right? We're talking about a notion of no absolutes. And in that same context, we're talking about trade-offs. When is the system open to something, some sort of impulse, some external variable, something in the environment? When is it open to push itself into the world? When is it open to sort of create signals that interact with others outside its own system? So I think as we walk through this, it's important to sort of think about that as the larger context about, very, very important topics like data, like artificial intelligence, and some of the other aspects of technologies out there, that they are rooted in this idea of systems where there are no absolutes and there are trade-offs and constraints. And I think it's fair to say much of what Sunil and I will be talking about over the next period of time is what those constraints look like, what those trade-offs look like, how should we best appreciate them as we look at modern day technologies.
Yeah, great starting point for the concept of openness, Richard. I would just like to add a little perspective to that definition. It's oftentimes these terms, you see it a lot in technology industry. You see it in the current debates in crypto of decentralized or distributed. You see it even in the AI industry. But I think it's really useful to first figure out what is the underlying purpose and goal of openness. Is it just is it a dogma? Is it religion? And what's the goal you're trying to achieve? Is it a policy objective? Is it a business objective? So really pay attention to who's using the word and why they're using it. I'll give you a few examples, like in the case of Meta and their open source or their open Lambda language model. They hail it as openness, and for the most part it is. But there's some critics to that model. There's some limits to the number of users you can add. So some of the purists would argue that it isn't completely open, but it's okay. I think for the case of Meta, they have their own definition and it works for them, and they've added a lot of value to the community, undoubtedly, and they're just doing very, very impressive and interesting work to be done there. If openness is open AI, that's a different company, different objectives, different goals. So it's really important to pay attention to who's saying it. If it's the regulators, they're trying to accomplish a certain policy goal. Is it trying to level the playing field or accelerate business adoption or innovation? So again, these are just, think of these as terms that are very amiable and is not good or bad per se. It really is contextually driven. And it's really important to understand what they are trying to ultimately achieve based on people who are speaking it.
Yeah, maybe to piggyback off of Joaquin's question and theme here about openness, in research, it's pretty straightforward. We just, we publish things on arXiv, we publish code to GitHub, and we think, in general that this promotes and helps the scientific community. And it's generally everybody benefiting from kind of this shared knowledge, right? And but Richard and Sunil, something you're pointing out is it means something different to everybody based off of who they are. So maybe to follow up a little bit here, who does openness really benefit? And maybe this is a loaded question, but Richard, maybe I can start with you here. Like, who's really benefiting? Is it as beneficial as researchers think? Like it's unilaterally beneficial.
Yeah, no, excellent question. I think, and this is very much sort of a generalization, openness tends to favor those who are not in power. It tends to favor those who are maybe smaller players who don't have access to vast resources, licensing and IP regimes. In the case, again, of sort of network-based software technologies, for example. So I think the notion is when you say the word open, you sort of, it triggers in your mind, it's some small startup, who's trying to create something really cool in the world. They want to put it out there. They want people to utilize it. So they're trying to, low market barriers and all that kind of thing. I'd also point to probably the most salient example of an open network is the internet. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is TCP/IP protocols. And Sunil and I both know Whitt Cerf. He's been a mentor of mine for many years. And when he and Bob Kahn wrote the standard and published it in 1974, Whitt is very open, quote, to say, hey, they could have charged a licensing fee for that, right? But the whole purpose of having it as an open standard was that anybody could build on top of it, and in turn, any network could run it, could operate it, right? And that really became a key aspect to its eventual success, certainly vis-a-vis more proprietary systems, online systems that came along later, like CompuServe and Prodigy and AOL. But another side of this people sometimes overlook is the process, right? So in the internet case, for example, creation of the standard was left to a set of volunteer engineers, the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. Later it came ICANN. But they developed these requests for comments, and this very, again, open process where anybody could come in, participate, and eventually, the standard would come out, and then the adoption would occur or not based on what the market dictated. So sometimes we overlook that process piece of this. And within the open source community, of course, it's very important. You have many eyes on a particular piece of software or code. That in turn ensures fewer bugs, right? A more robust sort of outcome. And so we talk about openness in the current context, things like around AI. We should be aware, and in pretty much all these cases, and there's one example I'll point to later on, it's being done by companies in a, quote, closed process and then put out into the world. So we should not overlook the fact it's not just about the substance of or reusability of or transparency of or extensibility of the thing that's being produced. It's also who's doing it, who's actually creating it in the back end.
Yeah, and Michelle, you raised two examples, the GitHub, the academic literature space. In both those cases, even under openness concepts, if you're a software engineer, you want to protect your IP. There's proprietary elements to it, but there are also parts of your development work that needs the assistance of a broader community, a broader group of engineers or developers who are looking at the software. So in the case of the academic literature, you have copyright and trademark, but even then they want to protect the ability, you want to encourage innovation, ability to people reward for their hard work in individual efforts. But oftentimes they need to get peer reviewed in order to get the broader adoption. So, these concepts, whether it be an idea or a certain code, to get the broader adoption, you'll have to open aspects of it in order to get that input and feedback, and to maybe improve upon it, and ultimately get that usage out in the world in a bigger sense. So I think we need to always balance these ideas of openness. I mean, whether you want to call IP or trademark intellectual property laws closed, but they do serve a purpose, and a very important one. So we don't want to discourage people from developing their own kind of hard work into the system. Now, what they want to contribute, obviously, Professor Cerf had different ideas of how he wanted to monetize it or not monetize it. His goals were different than perhaps Meta or Google's, and that's fine. So I think for us, we just pay attention to balancing these interests that are out there. But for my definition, personally, I think openness is ultimately leads to, in my view, in this context, competitive dynamics, right? The more competition, the more companies that are offering these types of services and innovation, the better the public ultimately benefits. It's not competition per se, it's ultimately what competitive markets lead to. They often lead to better service and better prices. And I know recent antitrust has been focused on just pricing, but I think it's important to look at what the price of it is, because nothing is really for free. It's just how they monetize it. So that's a different aspect there too. So I think for us and for me on a personal level, I think openness just goes down to, are companies unfairly using their market power to thwart innovation and competition, which ultimately hurts the public at large. What they're doing is not duplicitous or nefarious even, or illegal, or even perhaps unethical, but they're responding to a set of shareholders appropriately so. So I think in terms of our critiques, we need to be careful on what we're trying to accomplish there.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Teresa. How do we protect IP and still be open?
I was going to actually, I was going to piggyback a bit on what Sunil was just saying, and I think actually hopefully answers or helps to answer Teresa's question. Right. So we have sort of IP rights, intellectual property rights that have been established through copyright, trademark, patent law, United States. Of course, international treaties that adopt that for the most part as well. But that's not actually the only way you can go. Right. There's an organization, for example, called Creative Commons, which was set up some years ago as a nonprofit. And the purpose behind Creative Commons really was to say, you know what, we've got this IP regime which says either something is protected or it's not. In the copyright context, of course, we have fair use, which allows for certain exceptions to allow utilization of somebody's copyrighted work. But for the most part, it's fairly straightforward. It either is or is not under protection. What Creative Commons did was say, you know what, let's create some gradations here. Going back to this notion of like different aspects or different flavors of openness, let's create a different licensing regime where people can sort of pick and choose how much or little protection they want for certain aspects. One of the more popular ones I'm familiar with is to say, yeah, you can certainly use this all as you want to, as long as you attribute it to me. As long as I get proper attribution, in a public context, go have at it. So that's an example of, I think, an interesting innovation that perhaps allows you to go both ways, right? Gives you some degree of protection on your own terms, but still allows it, out in the world in a sense that other people can potentially build upon it.
Yeah, great question. I think it really comes to what part of the system or what part of the work you're actually opening in what terms. Even when things are open, there's still terms and restrictions. If you look at the Meta license, it's open arguably, and there are a lot of restrictions built into it. So it's okay. I don't think it's bad. I think it's appropriate to strike that right balance in terms of how do you protect your own work, but also you don't exist as a silo. You need to have that. Whatever you're building needs to interface with other things that are out there too, right? So I think it's a concept and goal that's a very moving target. One thing that was maybe useful to kind of put into context here is like if you're old enough to have a flip phone or BlackBerry, the telecom apps market was ostensibly very, very closed. They didn't have a full functioning browser. You didn't have the ability to do anywhere on the internet that you could on your phone back in those days. This is pre-iPhone. But now, again, it's come a long way, but that whole system really blew open thanks to, or at least we think it opened, thanks to, Steve Jobs and actually some of the work that Richard and I did at Google in terms of having open a kind of a platform, whether it be iOS or Android. Now, for most part, we all remember the ad campaign is an app for that, right? So in our phones right now, people think the iPhone became successful because of the phone. I would argue it's not the phone itself; it's the app stores that made it very popular, to the adoption levels we see today. Prior to that, it was very, very restrictive. You had to comport to the OEM manufacturers. You had to comport to the telecom requirements. And Google and Apple came along and got rid of essentially all of that. They unified one platform in which the developers can write to, whether it be iOS or Android. And there's a plethora. I don't know how many millions of apps that are out there too. That happened as a sequence of events that were pretty dramatic in a short period of time, given how long of a stranglehold the telecoms had on the infrastructure and the experience of their mobile phones. And for the most part, it was effectively closed. But now, that's been around for almost 18 years or 17 years. So, and ironically, both Apple and Google are being sued by the federal government on their app store practices of being too restrictive, using their market power. So these systems they're not static; they're always evolving. Arguably, what they did was an incredible thing. They blew open the idea of what a mobile phone can be, and brought to us a whole set of applications that are really dependent on the features of the phones, whether it be GPS, whether it be motion, and whether it be sensors. So it's a huge, huge innovation that we can't take for granted how we got there. Of course, like every system, when it gets too powerful, they're bound to abuse it. And, that's just kind of we've seen this overplayed in markets again and again throughout our history of innovation. So that's where there is a role for the government to help them step in and redefine what that is. But I think going back to what is it openness in the case of the app stores, it allowed a whole new set of developers to get access to mobile phones they'd never had before, and they could still monetize all their proprietary, their IP on the app itself.
I can just throw a quick comment in there on the mobile side. It's fascinating. Back in 2007-8, when of course we had Apple's release, and then shortly thereafter, of course, Google came up with Android. When Android was first announced, there were 32, I think, players as part of that initial press release. And there was this notion that this was sort of everybody else but Apple was behind Android, that this was this brand new thing that was going to be, quote, much more open than what was the case with Apple. And it was for a while, but to Sunil's point, nothing ever changes. Nothing is static, right? Things always change. And in this case, what you can look back at Android in 2008 versus where it is today. Android today is basically a Google standard, right? They basically control the show. They have stakeholders, they have vendors, they have certain developer communities they've developed with it. But by and large, they dictate whether and how Android, evolves over time. So the initial snapshot may have been true at that point. One could argue about, either side of that, but certainly over a period of time, Google decided it was in its best interest to be more in control of how this supposedly open standard was evolving particularly vis-a-vis Apple.
So I know, I love these concrete examples. This is really helpful, I think, and hopefully, Teresa, we answered your question. If there's a follow-up, please feel free to put questions in the chat, and that applies to anyone else that may have questions. We'll be monitoring that. But I want to go back to, Sunil, you mentioned, while we're on this idea of some very specific examples of technologies and what it means to actually be open and what is open functionality. So Sunil, you mentioned, this example of Meta, and right now licensing is also a super hot topic in AI specifically, right? And so one of the stipulations of the Meta license, which is quote unquote open source and open, is like you can't put it into some level of production. Like I forget the exact number, but let's say it's like 2 million, I don't know, some users or something like this, right? So it's free up until like a certain level of scale. Is that open?
It's open till you start to reach, I think it's almost 1 billion. Basically, when you get to the level of a threat to Facebook's products, then you need to close it down. So a little facetious there, but yeah, I mean, that's fine. I mean, they would argue that's very open, right? So, but if you look at if you were to ask some of the proponents from the Linux Foundation, they would probably take issue with that. But again, I don't think it's right or wrong. I think what Meta is doing is incredible service to the AI community. But again, these aren't philosophical or ideological stances. Zuckerberg would never open his social networks or his to WhatsApp or Instagram, and that's fine. No, I think it's unrealistic to expect that. But his idea is to by open sourcing the large language models and having all these developers build and grow upon that, he can take that development and then build proprietary experiences on his closed networks. That's his angle. I think he said it so much so in publicly. So this is not something that anything that's a secret. And that's a brilliant strategy on his part. And in doing so, he also contributes to the open source movement in the current AI debates. And ultimately, there's no either or. I do think just like as in software, you will have closed systems, you'll have open systems. I think the bigger issue to me is transparency. What is it that these large language models are consuming or using? Every day we put stuff in our mouth based on ingredients that we can clearly see. Of course, that even gets gamed a little bit in terms of what are the food ingredients. But if you look back at in the early 70s, there was a huge fight with the FDA about making companies put their ingredients in a format and structure that was very readable and understandable. Why would they want to fight that? It seems like obvious you want to put that ingredient stuff down because it informs the public in decisions that they put inside themselves. And so likewise, I think having some kind of transparency policy or models so we can see that helps everyone decide which large language models, which AI, to use for a certain purpose, certain need. So again, these systems, it's not a binary thing. It's like, as Rick mentioned earlier, they're matters of degree. And I think for us, as the ultimate goal is, when you say ultimately responsible AI, responsible products, I think every company may have a different definition of what that is from their standpoint. And oftentimes those definitions are designed or geared to further advance their competitive advantage. And again, these are normal things to do. But I think we just got to, so I say, pay attention to the speaker and what their incentives are ultimately. And most often is to enrich their shareholders, not educate the public.
Yeah, and if I can just again piggyback on that for a moment, I generally agree with Sunil. I think in this one I have a little different take, which is to say transparency is absolutely necessary. But when we're talking about these very large market players who essentially control these technologies, I don't think it's sufficient. One of the things that people I think ignore or have underplayed is in what context people are getting access to the Llama platform. Well, they're getting it through APIs, which are application programming interfaces. These are basically little nubs sitting on the edge of the network that allow developers to come in, utilize certain functionalities. APIs, to be clear, have been hugely beneficial, particularly so-called quote open APIs, where again people can come in and utilize them with probably limited licensing requirements, low fees, and that sort of thing. But I think again, what people don't sometimes realize, APIs are completely controlled by the platform, right? They dictate unilaterally the terms of service for each and every person who comes to use an API. So they could be transparent in what the requirements are, or what the capabilities are that people can gain access to when they utilize the underlying platform. But if tomorrow Llama said, you know what, we're being completely transparent, we're not going to charge you $1 billion to use our platform. That's complete transparency. But I'd also argue that, of course, in my mind, that's not being open. If openness includes the notion of trying to maximize the ability of users, large and small, to be able to have access to and gain appreciably from utilizing the underlying resource. So, to Sunil's point, Hal Varian, who is the chief economist currently at Google, wrote a book back in 1999 called Net Gain. And one of the quotes from that book I use a fair amount around town here in Silicon Valley. He says, when you control a gate, basically when you're a gatekeeper and you control an interface, the key lesson is this: you open it up, quote, or comma, but on your own terms. So that's the quote. You open it up, comma, but on your own terms. So Sunil's point, when it's in the best interest of a company, whether they're trying to gain market share or they're trying to evade regulators, they will talk openness. They will show some degree of openness. When they're trying to clamp down on a market or believe the regulators are not actually chasing them, they can use things like that API interface and the unilateral ability to change those terms anytime to their own benefit. So incentives are always the key here in terms of what's happening with the underlying resource.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Richard. I think it's important when you say openness, like is it openness in going to the OSI, going way back to the OSI kind of layers concept? Is openness to the transport layer, the data layer, or application layer, right? These are different aspects of the interfaces that allow systems to communicate and talk to one another. What part of it are you opening up? And in the case of Meta and Llama, they are the border patrol for that particular interface. They decide who and what terms to let in, and which is look, this is not anything inappropriate. They did. I think it's fair for them to have those terms and guidelines. It's just a matter of what is there? Is that something that's it just adds the debate and complexity. If it's not simply open or closed, it is a lot of different elements to it. Is worth investigating.
Thank you for giving us this just primer on openness. I think it's very important to lay the foundation of the rest of the conversation. I mean, incentives change, right? The size of the organization determines whether they want to maximize the amount of adoption. Once they get a certain number of people, do they want to maximize profitability and close it within a certain realm? It makes sense. So can we take a look at some of the concrete examples of technology being open or being closed or being some flavor of opaque, and what that has done to the immediate industry?
Yeah, well, again, I'll throw out a quick one. As I mentioned before, the internet, which is by way of both of sort of the process as well as what it created. And, I think it's no small thing to say that the internet is probably the most transformative technology in history. And you can, much of that is because of the openness. As I mentioned before, back in the early to mid 90s, before the web sort of took off, we had the online companies, CompuServe, Prodigy, AOL, right? They were closed proprietary systems. You had to pay, of course, to get on there. But eventually they rode on top of the internet, right? They were using the internet as the underlying resource. And once people became familiar with this notion that it had this quality where pretty much any application could be written to it. So as Sunil said, from sort of the top layers, all content and applications could ride on top of it. And then even more importantly, in a sense, any underlying network could then carry it, any bearer network, whether initially, fixed service, fixed then mobile, any kind of infrastructure underneath all of that. Didn't matter whether it was airwaves or fiber in the ground. The internet could use all of that. So that sort of notion of this sort of being a general bearer platform created this explosive ability for economies to be built on it. So I think that, to me, that's the single best example, still remains today, of openness from the context, again, of the process that created it and are still building it today. Engineers are still tuning the elements of it in terms of from where they sit to the actual aspect of it being a standard that anybody could utilize for pretty much any purpose. That still, to me, remains sort of the bellwether, and then everything else, in a sense, to me, sort of compares against that.
And a great example would be just what this video stream is going over. It's probably using some type of web RTC real-time communication platform. Again, the telecom is a great example of what's possible when a closed system becomes open. And when we were all there, but I think a lot of people remember Skype. And what Skype did was really blow open the telecommunications system from being closed to open in many different aspects. Prior to that, you'd have to traverse through a circuit switched networks were very effectively closed, and the interface between them was very difficult and very cumbersome to get access to. But what Skype did is popularize accessing the voice communications on the IP layer, IP network, and a lot of these were open source aspects. They popularized it. Now they built a lot of their own IP on top of it to make what it did was very, very powerful. And so to be able to call somebody in India or Europe for free, effectively, or through a data pipe, even though you have to speak in a computer, which is kind of weird, was worth it. But when it first came out, who hated it? AT&T hated it. The government hated it. The FBI hated it. But they all use it now. So, and the thing is, a lot of these incumbents or people in these positions where they're most affected by this disruption, even though they believe in the technology, they want to control that pace of adoption, that pace of disruption, so it doesn't be so disastrous to their own their spreadsheets, their profitability or their kind of revenue. So that's kind of what we're seeing here happening. And so I think it's important to look at within a very short period of time, even before the mobile app store, is the idea of how the telecommunications industry completely changed. And we don't even look at it resulted in the death of time and distance pricing. I used to remember to wait till 5 o'clock to call the East Coast and wait till 9 o'clock to call my family back in India. But now you can video conference anywhere in the world, anyone, as long as you both have a data plan. So that is an incredibly useful construct to think about how the development of the telecommunications can happen. In the case of what's happening now, I think, is also in the financial industry, the financial transaction layer. If you look at the open banking standards for standardizing payments, and a lot of the work that the crypto industry is trying to do, not the criminals, we're not the con artists, the actual companies that are really trying to attack how we get paid, how money moves around. Our ACH, our credit card transactions, our SWIFT, these are very, very, very old systems, and reminds me of the circuit switch infrastructure that we all lived under when AT&T was a monopolist. Once that starts to break up, it's still there. You'll see like incredible amount of innovation in the payment sector. Like, why do we wait every 2 weeks to get paid? Why can't we think of like streaming income? Why are they why do you have to wait so long to get transfer wires? There's reasons why, because they're running on old systems in which the banks and the incumbents benefit from for their fees. So they're not the ones going to really lead the charge. And if they do, it'll take forever to achieve these things. So I think what you're seeing is a lot of innovation happening in this space and some of the things that a lot of these crypto companies represent, but they do need some government help. They need clarity in regulations. They need clarity in the courts, and also to give confidence in the investors to support their endeavors. So I think that's what you'll see in terms of concrete examples, Joaquin, is as we have a new administration come in that's very crypto friendly, we may see some of the real benefits of the legitimate aspects of crypto that helps in the financial and the payments layer.
Maybe just to tag on to Joaquin's theme here. So you mentioned several examples like the internet, this super open process by which it was developed, right? And some of the telco and banking examples. There's obviously a lot of failed experiments too, but from these successful ones, what can we learn from these kinds of successful initiatives where openness was actually adopted? And maybe personally, I'm also interested in, do you think those processes work today?
I would say, yeah. I mean, I'll throw in one thought, which is it's the picks and shovels approach, right? It's the notion that you're not going to make money from the direct creation of the thing you're doing, whether it's a piece of software or a platform, but rather from all the activities that you're enabling that are able to utilize it, right? So that's the notion of, out here in the San Francisco Bay Area, when we first had the gold rush in 1859, most people didn't make money. The only folks who actually did make money were the one who were selling the picks and shovels to the people who were out there searching for gold in the streams, up in the foothills. So I think that's a similar approach. And frankly, that's exactly what the internet became, right? Most people did not become rich. Certainly Vince has done well, but he's not Elon Musk today, right? He put that in the world, and then other people built on top of it and made their fortunes that way. So I think that is, I think, a pretty important aspect of it to keep in mind. Again, it comes back to motivations. If your motivation is you want to take all the money for yourself as soon as possible up front, then maybe you have a more proprietary system. The downside is it may not get adopted as readily because you have your arms around it. So again, back to the trade-offs. How much do you want this in the world? People using it, maybe modifying it, improving it through the context of using open processes versus keeping it to yourself and maybe benefiting over the long term, benefiting more financially, but probably with the downside of having a much more narrow slice of the pie.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, Michelle, one possible playbook, which gets a little bit dicey, but is the idea of just solving a really, really hard user problem before they realize they even had it. I think oftentimes, this I learned from both Steve Jobs and also from Larry Page, is if you really solve a really hard user problem, then everything else kind of follows easy. The money will eventually follow, and the regulators will follow, because the politicians will follow. And in the case of like voice over IP, it was undeniable. Once it was out and realized how popular it was, they couldn't pull it back. There's no way they're able to then say, oh, well, we can't have it because of security concerns. We can't have it because it's going to destroy the network. It became very untenable to hold those arguments. So if we're able to show the mass popularity of a product, or the need and demand for the product, the politicians will follow because of that populist kind of support. And once they follow, the regulators will have to, fall in line as well too, because oftentimes these regulators are all co-opted by industry incumbents that have built and written many of the laws which they're trying to enforce. So I think that's a playbook that's difficult to do, but if you're able to just bring it out to the world quickly, to the point of mass adoption, and you see that there's a huge demand and need for this, and that the current system that we're living under, whether it be in the case of Jobs' music licensing regime and in the iPod, or the case of Nicholas Zenstrom in Skype, it's just you can't put it back in the bottle, so to speak. It becomes more, okay, then how do we manage this? How do we regulate this? And how do we bring this benefit to everybody else that's out there?
We have open data sets. We have open programming languages. We have open software of varying flavors, of varying gradients. When does it make sense to be closed?
When you're really successful, then you just close it down, close the border, close everything.
Yeah, that's back to the health variant approach, right? Well, I'll put it a little differently. I think you don't ever completely close, right? Again, I think there's such a negative connotation to the notion of running a closed network. What instead I think you do is you control the language around openness, and we're seeing some of this right now with the Llama releases coming out of Meta, right? I mean, there's a lot of fierce debate right now, including through the idea of sort of redefining what openness is. Is it about open data? Is it about open weights in the model? Is it about the transparencies? So like there's different pieces of that. But so I think the fight right now is going to be over, openness. And if one can claim that mantle while still basically being in control, as I suggested earlier around Android, then you've sort of won the rhetorical battle at least. And if you want the developers on your side and the user community who cares about that kind of thing, then that's a win. So yeah, I think these days it's more around who can control the high ground around how one defines the rhetoric around openness.
As well put, Rick. Richard, I have nothing to add to that.
Wow. Okay. First time ever, Sunil. Glad to hear.
Michelle, do you have any thoughts around that?
I am curious. It is interesting, and so I wonder some of it too, like this rhetoric around openness is some of this sort of like nitpicking because I think there's a lot of confusion. Like it generates a lot of confusion to be like, oh, okay, now we're gonna open the weights, but we're not going, and what does that mean to people, especially since they're not even familiar with what weights might be? And I don't know, like, so is part of that just a strategy within this desire for control over what openness means in the context of AI?
I mean, there are some people who have concerns around the security of open platforms, right? That if you have too much transparency and too much knowledge of what's going into particularly these very powerful LLM models, that you're giving the keys to the kingdom to the bad guys, right? And I think, there is something to that. You don't want a system, again, that's so open that pretty much anybody can walk up and use it and build whatever they want to on it. That could be problematic. And particularly creates huge liability risks for the underlying entity or company that created it. So, and that has again become part of the conversation is the security aspect. And so we watched this particularly in Europe when they've had conversations around the EU AI Act, right? There was some folks who said, oh, well, open platforms are even better, right? Because anybody has visibility into it. We can all see what's happening and therefore we can catch stuff quicker. There's a side that said, no, they're actually worse, because they're insecure, because anybody can get access to do terrible things. So there were these two camps that formed, and they were sort of opposed to each other diametrically in a sense of like, is an open system more or less secure? And I think it really comes down to, it sort of depends, which may not be totally helpful to this audience. Everything we're saying here, of course, has all these gradations and nuances and all that, which I, apologize for, but that's sort of that's sort of the part to take away, which is that it is contextual. It is something that you need to really sort of understand, again, motivations. What is the thing we're really talking about, and what are the pros and cons in any particular situation in terms of opening or not opening a piece of the platform?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of debate, legitimate debate, on the harms caused by AI and potential, threats that it may pose. And I think that needs to be balanced with the benefits of, bringing AI to the masses. Personally, I believe whatever dangers and threats caused by AI are best solved by AI. So I think you see this played out in cybersecurity. You see this played out in other areas as well. I think it is very powerful technology, just undoubtedly. But the most immediate threats that exist out there is less about the computers taking over. It's more about people using these systems in a very harmful way that makes it easier for them to cause the harm than perhaps before, because there are other systems and controls in place for it. If it gets too unruly, then it gets pretty problematic. So I think it's just really trying to make sure we try to maximize the benefits. If you're a policy maker or a regulator or a government politician, is figuring out how do you maximize the benefits of this new technology, advance your public and social goods, whether it be healthcare, education, jobs, to then at the same time minimize or try to keep your arms around the harms it can cause from it. If you take a too aggressive and prophylactic approach of preventing harms and not focusing on the benefits, I think they really run the risk of dangers of the innovation not reaching the people it needs to reach most.
Yeah, if I can just quickly jump on there, as a former public policy attorney, I give kudos to the larger web platform providers who are now becoming the AI providers. They've done a very masterful job of sort of controlling the rhetoric around AI. It's all now about the existential threats of AGI. It's all about building the guardrails to ensure, for example, that we're not having drones out there just killing people ad hoc, or having nuclear power plants being run solely by AIs with absolutely no human supervision. They've sort of sold that as the thing that policymakers need to worry about. And obviously those are concerns. But I think the thing, as Sunil's noting, is that, okay, but what about the stuff inside the guardrails? What about all the vast other arrays of things they want to provide to the world? And where are the humans? Where's the governance in those elements and those layers they don't want to talk so much about that, right? So I think they're trying to really point to other things to make policymakers run off and put in place certain restrictions, which I think, again, are all necessary, but not have this separate conversation. I think more important conversation in the near term about, is this technology actually helping people? Is this creating fewer or greater harms on the web for ordinary people in their day-to-day lives? And they're trying to get a job, trying to get a loan, trying to figure out what the heck's going on in their social media feed, all these things that are happening in your daily life. They don't want to have those types of conversations as much. So far, they've done a good job. I'm hoping in the coming months and years, we will have these kinds of conversations. I think they're important for all of us.
We have 2 comments. Teresa said, I agree with you, Richard. We need to create the right guardrails. And David is weighing in. He's saying, true, CVS Health open sources a lot of tech for people with disabilities. So,
and again, I'll go back to, that's great with CVS Health. I'm sure they're doing that for very legitimate purposes. We haven't talked about the other piece of this today. This is an open data science forum. So how does one define data? That can be a whole nother can of worms here. But just quickly to say, we don't have a good handle on the data policies of these entities who are out there with AI systems. They are taking advantage of, quote, the open web by scraping all the stuff that's there, including stuff that apparently is subject to copyright, which of course is now sitting in a few court cases. So this is an interesting situation where sort of the openness is being utilized for sort of private gain, right? Even though it's sort of a public commons. Is that an appropriate use of the open web? And particularly if we don't have great insights into, what's happening with the data once they ingest it, where is it stored? Is it subject to breaches, bad acts and all that kind of good thing? So the data piece of this, the element of like our daily lives, how we're living our lives, whether it's our personal data, whether it's environmental data, non-personal, wherever it's all coming from, also it needs to be, I think, a part of the equation as you try to think about this larger sense of what is open, who's benefiting from it, and what say, if any, do we ordinary people have in these processes.
Michelle, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk more about that in, I think, the subsequent panel. I'm sure Teresa will have a lot to talk about in terms of the data element. Maybe if we have time for one last very, very quick question. Obviously, this is a really complicated landscape. Briefly, how do you both think about sort of how openness and startups are supposed to navigate this?
Well, I guess it's really hard for startups to get into these kind of policy debates and fights. They are still very expensive to engage, and the money they raise from their investors are meant to change policy per se. They're meant to build products within the existing policy framework and to get users and ultimately at some point make money. So it's really difficult for them to have these kind of, or get. Of course, they can make statements of what they'd like the world to be, but they're not designed per se. The structure of startups, the funding of startups, and the goals of them are mainly to build the products that people want to use based on this innovation that we see. And then, as if there's some roadblocks or barriers to that broader adoption that come out there, that could be, if those can be removed by taking a more broader approach or more of a, I guess, openness approach to certain parts of the industry, then they can get, then it becomes more tenable for them to create a coalition or a group and to subscribe to certain, campaign activities that would advance their own goals. But it's really difficult for startups to actually have these kind of debates at a meaningful level.
Yeah, I would just say most startups don't have the wherewithal to be sort of purists around this, right? If you can come in this and say, oh, we just want to be, open to everybody, that sounds great, but you got to make some money at some point. You got to pay back your investors and serve customers and all that. So I think it's just to be aware that there are these various decision points along the way in terms of how you build your systems, how you utilize third-party systems, how you engage with the developer community, right? There's a rabid developer community around the notion of openness that are out there on GitHub and elsewhere. So maybe tapping into that by keeping certain aspects of what you're doing open, right? Quote unquote again. So I think you just have to be very aware, strategic about where openness is useful to you, beneficial to your company, and where it may be more problematic, and you just can't afford the trade-off. You want to have IP rights that are strong and tied down, show your investors that on your balance sheets and all of that. So I think just to be aware of the trade-offs and try to choose as best you can.
Well, with that, thank you very much, Richard and Sunil. We're going to take a brief intermission, and then we're going to jump into the second facilitated networking session. So if you'd like to meet new people, hang around, and join us in that session, we'll see you guys there. And thank you both for giving us a treatise on openness.
Thanks, Joaquin. Thanks, Michelle. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.